the Duchess of Wickham, was bleeding through her glove, and not one of the 300 guests in her own ballroom would meet her eye. Eleonora stood beside the marble fireplace at Wickham House, her gloved hand pressed lightly to her side, where the Dowager Duchess's painted fan had struck her not hard enough to bruise the skin, but hard enough against the fresh stitching of a gown sewn only that afternoon to part the silk beneath. A single dark bead now darkened the wrist of her glove. Around her, candlelight glittered on diamonds and orders and ribbons of state, and the orchestra played a country dance, and the most powerful family in England carried on as though the new Duchess were not standing 8 feet away with blood on her hand. "A common little thing," she heard Lady Margaret murmur behind a Chinese fan, loud enough to carry. However, did Sebastian come to choose her? They say her mother kept an inn somewhere in Hampshire. They say she walked into his life on a muddy road with no name to give and no people to send for. A small laugh moved through the cluster of gowns near the orchestra, the way wind moves through wheat. A footman passed Eleonora with a tray and looked, quite deliberately, past her shoulder. At the far end of the long room, her husband, of 4 months, stood in conversation with the Earl of Harrogate. His back was turned. It had been turned for nearly an hour. It had been turned, in truth, since his mother had brushed past Eleonora in the receiving line and announced audibly that the new Duchess was still learning which spoon to lift, and Sebastian, with his cool gray eyes and his measured voice and his reputation for never being moved by anything, had given the smallest, politest laugh. That had been the worst of it. Not the fan, not the footman, not the Dowager's quiet campaign of humiliation that had begun in September and had not, in any kindness, ceased. It was the laugh. The careless, untroubled laugh of a man who believed his mother's account of his own wife because believing it cost him nothing. Eleonora drew a long breath and let her hand fall. She would not weep in this room. She had wept once, in her dressing chamber after the first family dinner, and she had promised herself it would be the last time the Wycombes saw water on her face. Beneath her bodice, against the warm skin above her heart, hung a small thing of worked silver, older than the Wycombe dukedom, older than half the orders pinned to the gentlemen in this room, and her fingers, hidden in the folds of her skirt, found it now and closed around it. Had the Dowager Duchess known what hung on that chain, she would not have raised her fan to the girl who wore it. Had Sebastian asked, even once, who his wife had been before he had found her walking on that road in Hampshire, the laugh he had given his mother tonight would have died in his throat before it could leave it. But none of them had asked. And 5 days from this evening, on the night of the Queen's drawing room, a rider would dismount in the lantern-lit courtyard of Wickham House, with mud on his boots, a sealed paper in his coat, and an order of service signed in a hand, no Englishman alive refused, and every name laughing in this ballroom tonight would learn, to the last shilling and the last invitation, what their laughter had cost them. For now, Eleonora set her empty glass on the mantel, lifted her chin a fraction higher than was perhaps quite proper, and began to walk, slowly and without haste, the long length of polished floor toward her husband's turned back. The orchestra moved into a minuet as she crossed the room, and the women she passed dipped curtsies that did not quite reach the depth her rank required. She marked each of them Lady Margaret, with her Chinese fan, Mrs. Caraway in her ostrich plumes, the young Miss Pelham who had once asked her, with bright, vicious sweetness, whether innkeepers' daughters were taught to dance. Eleonora had answered that they were taught a great deal that gentlewomen were not. She had not been forgiven the reply. Sebastian did not turn until she was beside him. Even then, he only inclined his head, the courtesy a man pays to an acquaintance who has joined his conversation uninvited. The Earl of Harrogate, who had the better instincts of the two, flushed and excused himself. "My dear," Sebastian said, "are you enjoying the evening?" She kept her voice low. "Your mother struck me with her fan." He looked at her then, really looked for the first time since the receiving line. His gray eyes moved over her face, her shoulder, the fold of her skirt. He did not see the glove. She had not lifted her hand. "My mother is 63 years old," he said, and her eyesight is uncertain in a crowded room. I imagine she did not see you. She saw me, Eleonora. She saw me, Sebastian, and she struck me, and you laughed when she said, I did not know which spoon to lift. A muscle moved in his jaw. He glanced past her, at the ballroom, at the 300 guests who were watching them now, without seeming to. This is not the place, he said quietly. No, she agreed. It is not. It has not been for some time. She inclined her head, in something that was almost but not quite a curtsy, and turned, and walked from the ballroom. And the silk between the long fingers of her glove was cold by then, and stiff. She climbed the great stair alone. No woman of any consequence offered her arm. Her own maid Phoebe, a girl from the Hampshire village, who had come up to London with her and had never quite stopped being frightened of the marble, and the gilt, was waiting in the dressing room with red eyes, having heard already, by that strange, swift route on which servants' news travels, what had passed downstairs. Ma'am, Phoebe whispered, your glove. What? Eleonora drew it off slowly. The cut was no longer bleeding. The edge of the fan had caught her at the place where her ribs ended and her waist began, drawn a clean, small line through the silk and a less clean line through the linen beneath. The skin had stopped weeping into the fabric perhaps an hour ago. Burn the gown, she said. It was new this afternoon, ma'am. Burn it. Phoebe nodded and did not argue. When the bodice came away, the pendant on its silver chain swung free against Eleanor's chest, and Phoebe, who had seen it every night for 4 months and had never once asked, could not, this time, keep her eyes from it. It looked tonight, she said carefully, as though her ladyship's mother saw that piece and took a turn. Eleanora went still. What do you mean, Phoebe? In the line, ma'am, when you came in. I was standing behind the great vase, with the cloaks. The dowager looked at your throat where the chain crossed it, and she went the color of paper, and she put out her hand to the wall. Then she straightened, and she came past you, and she said the thing she said. I thought at the time it was only the heat of the room. Eleanora's hand closed over the silver. The metal was warm from her skin. She had worn it every day of her life she could remember. She had been told by the woman who raised her that it had belonged to her mother and that she was to keep it hidden until the proper hour, and she had even from Sebastian, even on the night she had become his wife, she had drawn it under her shift before he came to her, and she had never given him the chance to ask what it was. The dowager had recognized it. The dowager had known. Sebastian Wykeham was not a cruel man. He was a man of 41 who had inherited a dukedom at 27 and had spent the intervening years learning that affection, if shown to anyone in his world, was treated as currency and spent without his consent. He had buried 2 friends, one mistress and a sister he had loved more than was decent. He had made of himself a very still surface, on which nothing showed. He had married Eleonora because she was the first woman in 14 years who had not appeared, on inspection, to want anything from him. He had found her on the Petersfield Road in the wet October of the previous year, walking with a single bandbox, having missed her coach. He had taken her as far as the next village, and then, finding that she had nowhere to be expected, and no one to expect her, had taken her further. She had been 23, grave, beautifully spoken, and entirely alone. He had married her in a quiet Hampshire chapel 6 weeks later, and had brought her to London with a half-formed and not entirely conscious belief that his mother, who had been quietly breaking the spirit of women for 50 years, would not, this time, succeed. He had been wrong about that. He stood now by a window in his library, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, and considered, for the first time and with some unease, the conversation he had just had with his wife. She saw me, Sebastian, and she struck me. He had not believed it, or rather, he had not allowed himself to believe it, which was, he was beginning to understand, a different thing. He set the glass down. He had laughed at his mother's joke in the receiving line. He had laughed because the joke had not been about him, and because he had drunk a glass of champagne too quickly, and because Eleonora had looked, in that moment, so composed that he had assumed with the careless assumption of a man who has never had to fear for his own dignity that she had not minded. He understood, suddenly, that she had minded. that she had minded the laugh more than the joke, that she had minded it perhaps more than she had minded the fan. He went to find his mother. The dowager was in the small drawing room at the end of the gallery, taking tea with her sister, Lady Margaret. Both women rose when he entered, and both, after a glance at his face, sat again very carefully. Sebastian, my love, you look unwell. Mother, he closed the door. Did you strike my wife with your fan tonight? The dowager's eyes moved briefly to her sister. What an extraordinary question. Did you? My darling, the room was crowded. If I touched her, I did not ask if you touched her. I asked if you struck her. There was a small pause. The dowager set down her cup with infinite care. She is a common girl, Sebastian. I have endured her in this house for 4 months because you required it, but she is common, and she is hiding something, and the longer she remains under this roof, the more harm she will do to a name your father gave his life to keep clean. What is she hiding, Mother? I beg your pardon? You said she was hiding something. You have been saying it for 4 months. You said it within an hour of meeting her. What, precisely, do you imagine my wife is hiding? For the first time in the conversation, his mother's face did something he had never seen it do. It hesitated. A girl who walks alone on a road in October, she said at last, with no name to give, is hiding a great deal. You have never asked her name. I know the names of innkeepers' daughters. You do not know that she is an innkeeper's daughter. You decided that she was. Lady Margaret, who had been silent, said suddenly, Sebastian, your mother has been most patient. Be quiet, aunt. Lady Margaret was quiet. The dowager drew breath to speak, and did not. He watched her, and saw perhaps for the first time in his life, or perhaps for the first time he had been willing to see that his mother was afraid. Not of him, of something else, of something she was not saying. What is it, he said softly, that you are not telling me about my wife? She did not answer him. She looked into the fire, and her hands lay still in her lap, and after a long moment he understood that she would not answer him, and he left the room, and the door closed softly behind him on a silence that was, he now realized, considerably older than this evening. He found Eleonora at last in the library, in the great chair by the dying fire, with a single candle on the table beside her, and a book unopened in her lap. Eleonora, I should like, she said, without looking up, to leave this house for a little while. Cousin Wykeham has offered me the dower house at Ashbridge until Christmas. I have written to accept. You will not go to Ashbridge. Then I shall go to Hampshire. He came and knelt beside her chair. It was not a posture his rank or his temperament often permitted. She looked at him then, at last, and he saw beneath the composure she had worn for 4 months as a second gown that she was very tired and very young, and not, after all, quite as alone as she had taught herself to seem. Stay until Friday, he said. Stay until the Queen's drawing room. After that, if you wish to go, I will take you to Hampshire myself. Why Friday? He could not immediately answer. He had not known, when he opened his mouth, why Friday. He knew only that something was coming, and that his mother was afraid of it, and that he would not have his wife on the Petersfield Road alone again. Stay, he said, please. It was the first time in 4 months of marriage that he had used the word. She stayed. The next 4 days, in the long history of Wykeham House, would afterwards be remembered by the servants as the days of the closed doors. The Duke shut himself in his study and sent for his solicitor, his man of business, and a quiet, hard-eyed gentleman from the Foreign Office who had been at school with him and who left after an hour with a sealed letter in his coat. The dowager took to her rooms with the headache. Eleonora sat in the small parlor, wrote 2 letters in her own hand, one to Hampshire, one to an address in St. James's Square, that no servant in the house recognized, and sealed both with plain wax and no crest. On Wednesday a parcel arrived for her by private messenger. It contained a small enamel miniature, in a velvet case, of a young woman with Eleonora's mouth and Eleonora's gray eyes, and a circlet of pearls in her dark hair. Phoebe, who brought it up, said nothing. On Thursday morning, Eleonora sent for the Dowager Duchess. The Dowager came. Whatever else she was not a coward, and she had been summoned by her son's wife in her son's house, and there were forms even she would not break. She stopped 2 paces inside the door, because Eleonora was standing at the window, and the morning light was on her face, and the silver chain at her throat lay outside the bodice of her gown for the first time. "Sit down, madam," Eleonora said. The Dowager sat. "You recognize this," Eleonora said, lifting the pendant on its chain. "On the evening of our wedding, in the chapel at Winford, you recognized it. My maid saw your face. On Tuesday last, you struck me in my own ballroom, hard enough to draw blood in front of 300 witnesses. You have spent 4 months attempting to drive me from this house. I should like to know why." The Dowager's hands in her lap were quite steady. Only her mouth gave her away, the small, tight, trembling line of it. "I do not know what you mean." "You knew my mother." The Dowager closed her eyes. "You knew my mother," Eleonora went on, very softly, "and you knew what she gave me, and you knew where I was sent. You have known, since the moment you saw this chain at my throat in October, who I am. You have known, madam, longer than I have." The Dowager said nothing. "My husband does not know," Eleonora said. "I have not told him. I had not intended, when I married him, ever to tell him. I had intended to be only what he believed me to be, and to live a quiet life, and to be, for the first time in 23 years, an ordinary woman in an ordinary house. You took that from me, madam, with your fan and your sister and your laughing friends, and now I find I should very much like to know why." The Dowager opened her eyes. They were wet. "Because your father," she said, "took my daughter?" The fire snapped in the grate, and the Dowager flinched at the sound, and went on. "Your mother wrote letters to my husband. They were not the letters of a friend. They were not even, perhaps, the letters of a lover my husband had not, to my knowledge, ever touched her. But he had, in his vanity, kept them, and they were found, and they were brought to your father. And your father, my dear, is not a forgiving man. He did not punish my husband. My husband he could not afford to punish. He was Lord Lieutenant of 3 counties, and a vote in his lordship's interest. Your father punished my Caroline. Caroline, my daughter, Sebastian's sister. She was 19. Your father required her, by private letter, to accept the suit of an elderly Neapolitan cousin of his late mother's, a man of 62, with the gout and a rotten temper, and to accompany him to his villa in the Bay of Naples, and to never return to accepting England. She was on the boat within the month. She was dead within the year. The fever, they wrote me. She had not been strong. The Dowager's hands, at last, were not steady. I buried her by letter, madam. I never saw her body. And then your mother died, and your father grieved her. The woman whose letters had cost me my child, and the court mourned her. And there was no court above the king to which I might apply, no justice that might be sought, because the man who had done it was the king, and there is none above him in this country. There never has been." She looked up, and her face was the face of an old woman, and not, any longer, the face of a duchess. "And then 4 months ago my son came home and brought a girl in from a Hampshire road, and the girl wore at her throat a piece of Spanish silver I had last seen at the throat of a queen, and she had the queen's mouth and the queen's eyes, and I understood, God help me, child, I understood at once, that the daughter the queen was rumored to have lost in infancy had not been lost at all. She had been hidden, and she had walked, by some appalling joke of Providence, into the house of the woman whose daughter her father had killed." Silence. "I could not bear it," the Dowager said quietly. "I am sorry. I could not bear it. I tried to drive you out before he found you, because I did not want him in this house. I did not want him at this hearth. I did not want, again, to lose what was mine to a man I cannot answer." Eleonora sat down, very slowly, in the chair opposite. The pendant lay between them on its silver chain, catching the morning light. The Queen's drawing-room was held at St. James's Palace on the Friday afternoon, and at 4 o'clock, while half of London was being handed up the steps of the palace by liveried footmen, A single rider came along Piccadilly at a hard trot and turned into the courtyard of Wickham House. Sebastian was at the window of his study and saw the man dismount. He saw the mud on the boots, the dispatch case across the shoulder, and the small embroidered device on the breast of the coat, which was not the device of any house but one. He went down himself to meet him. "Your Grace," the rider said, "an order of service from His Majesty, to be read in your presence, and in the presence of the lady your wife, this evening, at 7 of the clock, by the gentleman whose name appears on the seal." Sebastian took the paper. The seal was the Lord Chamberlain's. "His Majesty," the rider added, "will himself attend at 7:30. Sebastian, who had not in his life been at a loss for words in his own courtyard, found himself for a moment without any. Then he said, "Inform His Majesty that this house and every soul in it is at his disposal." The rider bowed and remounted and was gone. Sebastian stood in the courtyard with the paper in his hand and the late winter light on his face, and he understood, quite suddenly and quite completely, what his mother had been hiding, and what his wife had been wearing under her gown for 4 months, and what the cold settled fear in his chest had been since Monday night. And he understood, also, that he had been a fool. He went upstairs to find Eleonora. She was already dressed. She had been dressed, he realized, for an hour. She wore a gown of dove-gray silk, and the pendant openly at her throat, and a small, almost plain circlet of pearls in her dark hair. She did not look like an innkeeper's daughter. She did not look like the Duchess of Wickham. She looked like the woman in the miniature on the bedside table, the one he had seen on Wednesday night when he came in to look at her sleeping, and had not, then, asked. "You knew," he said. "I knew. Why did you not tell me?" She turned from the glass. "Because I had spent 23 years being the king's lost daughter," she said, "and I wished, for a little while, to be only your wife." He could not, for a moment, speak. "I have failed you," he said at last. "Yes, Eleonora, you have failed me, Sebastian, and I will not pretend that you have not, because I have done a great deal of pretending in this house, and I am tired of it. You believed your mother because believing her cost you nothing. You laughed at her joke because the joke was not aimed at you. You turned your back on me in my own ballroom for an hour while I bled into my glove. These are not things a man can undo with a pretty speech in a dressing room 10 minutes before the king comes to the door." She drew on her gloves, fresh ones, white. "But you are not, I think, a cruel man. I think you have been a careless man, and I think you are about to be embarrassed before your sovereign. And I think," her voice softened, "just a little, I think that what you do in the next 2 hours will tell me whether you are a man worth staying with after Christmas or only the man who found me on a road. I have not yet decided. What do you wish me to do?" "I wish you," she said, "to stand beside me when he comes." At 7 o'clock, the Lord Chamberlain was admitted to the great drawing-room of Wickham House, where the Duke and Duchess stood, and where the Dowager Duchess, who had not been told what was coming, and to whom Eleonora had said only, "Madam, you will be present," sat in a chair by the fire, with her hands clasped in her lap, and her face the color of paper. The Lord Chamberlain read the order of service. He read that on this 23rd day of February, by the King's most excellent Majesty's own hand, the Lady Eleonora Maria Sophia, only surviving child of His Majesty by his late Queen, was acknowledged before God and the realm that her place in the order of precedence stood next after the princesses of the blood, that her marriage to Sebastian, Duke of Wickham, was confirmed and sanctified, and that all honors, properties, and incomes pertaining to a princess of the royal house were, from this hour, hers. The Dowager made no sound. Her hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles whitened. At 7:30, the king came. He came without state, only 2 riders behind him, no trumpeter, no herald, and he came up the steps of Wycombe House like any private gentleman, and Eleonora went to meet him at the door. Sebastian, watching, saw his wife, his composed, careful, half-stranger of a wife, drop into a curtsy so deep that her knee almost touched the marble, and he saw the king lift her up by both hands, and he saw her face when she looked up at her father for the first time since she had been an infant, and he understood then what had been beneath the composure. All this while, the king turned, with Eleonora's hand in his, and considered Sebastian. "Your Grace, sire, you did not know. No, sire, I did not. And what is your view now that you do? Sebastian, who had spent 41 years arranging his face, did not arrange it. That I should have known, sire, that I should have asked, that the laughter of mine, in my receiving line, was the act of a man myself, sire, who took his wife's silence for contentment, because it was easier than asking. I do not seek my wife's forgiveness in your presence. I ask only that I be permitted to seek it, in time, in private. Other. The king looked at him a long moment. Then he turned to his daughter. My dear? Time, Papa, Eleonora said softly. I think I should like to give him time. The king nodded and turned, and his eyes, which were gray and very cold, fell upon the Dowager Duchess, who had risen from her chair and stood now, very small, in the center of the room. Madam, sire, I owe you, the king said, a daughter. The Dowager Duchess, who had borne the loss of Caroline alone for 20 years, who had carried her grief into cruelty because there had been no other place to put it, who had been waiting, perhaps, for this moment longer than she knew, went to her knees on the carpet of her son's drawing room, and she wept, at last, where someone could see. The king crossed the room and lifted her up himself. What he said to her, no one in the room afterwards repeated, not even Sebastian, who stood 5 feet away and heard every word. It was said quietly, and it was said for her alone, and when it was finished, the Dowager Duchess of Wickham, who had not in 50 years of public life begged any human being for anything, kissed the king's hand, and the king let her. The story of what passed at Wykeham House that evening was, of course, all over London by the next morning. The names of the guests who had laughed in the ballroom, Lady Margaret, Mrs. Caraway, Miss Pelham, and a dozen others were quietly omitted from the next list of presentations at court, and from the list after that, and from every list of any consequence for a long while afterwards. 2 of those names left town for the country and did not return that season. 1 never returned at all. Cards stopped being received. Invitations stopped being issued. Society, which had laughed, found that the king had a long memory and a longer reach, and behaved accordingly. The Dowager Duchess retired to her dower house in Kent by her own request and her son's consent, and lived quietly there until her death 7 years later. She and Eleonora corresponded. The letters, which still exist in the Wykeham archive, are short and careful, and, at the end, very tender. In her will, the Dowager left to her daughter-in-law a small enamel miniature of a girl of 19, with dark hair and a steady mouth, and a single line in her own hand. She would have loved you, my dear, as, in the end, did I. Sebastian and Eleonora did not, that winter, go to Ashbridge or to Hampshire. They went, by the king's request, to the small estate at Winford that had been her mother's, and they spent 6 months there, and they learned, slowly, and not without difficulty, how to speak to one another in the way they had not before. He was 42 by the time she forgave him. She told him so on the morning of their first child's birth, in the chamber where her mother had once slept, with the spring rain on the windows, and the silver pendant lying, as it had always lain, against her heart. I forgave you in October, she said. I only thought you should wait to hear it. He laughed a real laugh, this time not a polite one, and he kissed her hand, and he did not, for the rest of his life, ever again turn his back on her in any room they were both in. If this story moved you, hit the like button and tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven Sebastian or made him wait longer than October? And if you love stories about quiet women who turn out to be more than the world believed, subscribe. There's another one waiting for you next week, and the woman in it has been underestimated for far too long.